wanted to do something a little bit different with, we often will have a relatively uninterrupted presentation and then do Q&A at the end. This time I want to have a little bit more sort of interaction as we go, because what I'm basically doing is I'm going to be putting up what I think are key highlights in the history of the sort of intellectual and practical development of humanism, and I think I'd like to just sort of discuss each of them. I don't have a whole lot, and I think it'd be useful to have some dialogue. So I'm going to start with some of the earliest developments. I'm going to start with this guy. Now, Martin Luther was a very religious man. He was a priest, and then he broke away from the Catholic Church. And so you might say, well, why is he a big guy in humanism? I often say that Martin Luther got us halfway there. And by that I mean, he took us from a very hierarchical, very controlling religious ethos and practical structures of social control to a much more pluralistic and open society. I mean, it wasn't totally open, and we can talk about that. But the key thing was the notion of conscience, that you should follow your inner voice, that you shouldn't be guided by the higher teachings of the church that come down from God and through the Pope and through the bishops and through the priests to you little peons who really don't know anything and shouldn't be uppity. He's saying every human being should be able to introspect, think about what they think is right and wrong, follow their conscience, and interact with God in their own way, on their own time, without intercession by a priest, with reference, there was a lot of reference to the Bible, obviously, but he was trying to get people to actually read the Bible, and that was salutatious too, because it got people actually looking at the text and going, say, what? and it got people critically thinking about the teachings of the church. It also divided the political power of the day away from Rome and splintered it in a bunch of ways that caused wars and all sorts of tumult, but it also opened the field for new thinking and letting new ideas bloom. So the rejection of intercession by the priest, no more confession, so you didn't have this notion where you had this basically thought police where the priest was basically insisting that every parishioner tell them all their secrets so that they can then understand what's going on. It's basically a spy network and very efficient in social control.
What year?
This, 1509, I think it is, when he posted the theses on the Church of Wittenberg.
1517.
What? 17? 1517, okay.
85 theses on the
Right.
Church of Wittenberg.
There you go. I should have prepped that in my mind. But the neat thing about that is in 2017, which was not that long ago, the Pope actually took note of the 500th anniversary and with grace, as opposed to with consternation, which I thought was like astounding. I mean, this is Pope Francis, right? Very progressive and trying to be a little bit more harmonious in the world. But that was very impressive. Somewhat, yeah. Halfway, right?
Progressive.
Yeah. So, and then I guess the other thing is just this rejection of hierarchy, the rejection of the opulence of the church, criticism of the amount of resources and money that were being pulled out of the peasantry and used to build St. Peter's, and the selling of indulgences, all the corruption in the church. That was Martin Luther. And there were warnings, of course, by the church fathers who said, oh, well, if you don't listen to us, if you reject the church teaching, then anything goes, right? And there was a lot of fear-mongering, and there were some actual some sort of test cases where that happened, where the the fact that the church hierarchy was no longer laying it on meant that people did go a little nuts. There's a famous case of the Siege of Munster, where some Protestants, Anabaptist folks, basically, there was this guy who became a very charismatic Christian guy, right? And he created his own cult in Munster, and he was one of these guys who, you know, parishioner would ask him something, or something would come up, and he'd say, "Oh, let me consult God." "Oh, God says," and he was incredibly influential, and he got these people, you know, all wound up, and the local Catholic nobles and they laid siege to the town, and there was a multi-year siege, and people starved, and all sorts of crazy stuff went on. And you could chalk that up to not listening to the Pope anymore. But despite the fact that there were some things that went off the rails, the lack of papal control, the lack of that hierarchy did open up the field for humanist ideas and other ideas, many, many different sorts of ideas, to flourish and grow. Any other thoughts about Luther?
Yeah. Movable type and the importance of printing Bibles,
Right.
and other literature.
Right.
And
So
spreading those ideas in local languages as well, not just in Latin. And because some of these movements might stay very local.
Right.
Had they not been travel via books.
right. So that's the Marshall McLuhan good comment, which is the media's message is that this was a technology-enabled social and intellectual revolution because of the ability to print Bibles, hymnals, and prayer books, and also theses and ideas and you know, political tracts and dissent, indeed, and to be able to publish that widely. So yes, movable type, the Gutenberg Bible, all that stuff. Any other thoughts about Martin Luther? Yeah?
Getting away from the religious part, what is never taught, hardly ever taught, I only learned it in high school, in the first years in college, and only because it's in Germany. Here it's not never talked about. He was, because he was being supported by one of the leaders,
One of the electors of the Holy Roman Empire? Yeah.
let him do his thing on the right. When it came to the peasant revolt, he was not supporting the peasants at all. He only was supporting that hierarchy. The secular hierarchy, he was supporting that big time.
Right, he wasn't a socialist.
No.
Yeah.
No, he did not help the peasants at all.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And what's one thing I was going to say?
Question.
Yes.
If we're talking about humanism right now, why are we not taking it to pre-Christian times?
Well, I'll do that a little bit in a moment. And in fact, we can move on. So the Renaissance, right? So the Renaissance was around this same time, beginning in Italy mostly, but then caught fire all over Europe. And this was the rediscovery and appreciation of pre-Christian knowledge and culture, the rediscovery of books, scrolls from ancient monasteries, where they dug stuff up that was very obscure even to the monks, that they just used for basically calligraphy practice. They would take these old books, they would take Lucretius, and they would dutifully copy it without really thinking about it. They would dutifully copy it as a penmanship exercise, but they weren't taking that out of the monasteries and bringing it to the world. But the early sort of the humanists who were interested in they were almost like, it was almost like an archaeological exercise. We'd go into these old monasteries and find these things and go, wow. And it was really mind-blowing to read Lucretius or read Cicero or all these ancient authors from Rome, and the knowledge that they brought from Greece through Rome. I think it was mostly Latin texts that they...
Epicurus.
Yeah, Epicurus. Yep, absolutely. And additionally, the notion that during the Renaissance, art and literature started to focus beyond Christian subjects and into the humanities. So if you go to like the Met or any other major art museum and you see the art of the Middle Ages, you'll just see one goddamn Madonna and Child after another. And there's like they were doing nothing else but Madonna and Child and a few other religious subjects, but they would never paint their grandmother. They would never paint the mayor of the town. They would never paint the signing of some important document or some other historical subject or just, some beautiful landscape or whatever. Well, who was paying for it? But it was just, they really, I think there was really a cultural taboo to using art for purely secular subjects. And they were very focused on, people, some of the early explorers, they would find some new place and they would name it after a saint, right? Or they would find some new thing, like when the outer planets were first discovered, like Uranus and Neptune. They'd name them after their king, or they'd name them after a saint, whatever. And those names didn't stick. But for many years, Uranus was called, in Britain, was called George's star for King George, right? They had no imagination other than to patronize they're either their secular powers or the church.
Think about our states named after,
Yeah.
after Virginia, Georgia.
Right?
Yep. Our places as well,
Right.
New York, obviously,
Yep.
the like, but we still do it.
Right. But the Renaissance is really this flowering of turning creativity into a secular subject.
More so in the Netherlands, in that region, than in, we think of the Renaissance as Italy. I would say the Humanist Renaissance is much more available and obvious in the Netherlands, Amsterdam, where because of trade, different kinds of peoples, different languages, different religions all came together, and then you had an artisan culture, and you had business culture, and you had people who were literate at different levels, and also even people who were, you would think of as lower socioeconomically, who actually dressed very, very well and presented very well in society, because I do believe that they had a much stronger earlier humanist tradition in that region. Think about who did Rembrandt also. Right? Think about Spinoza and his contributions and his coterie, all the people who were around him. He didn't publish much while he was alive, but we know later on that that humanist culture was huge in that.
And the Renaissance is also technology based, new shipbuilding technologies, fostered trade, and you got the merchants who became wealthy.
Rembrandt was very well known. He started painting women, but also non-religious figures a lot earlier than other artists in other regions.
And I was going to say, even the Reformation and the spread of Protestantism was economically motivated, because sovereigns in Northern Europe, kings and dukes and such, just realized, wait, if I sign on with these radicals, I can take over all the church's property, and now it's mine. And I can then do with that as I see fit. I can parse that out to my nobles and for their loyalty. I can do whatever I want, but I now don't have to deal with the church's authority anymore. And that spread like wildfire through the northern German, the Scandinavia. They all said, "Oh, sign me up. We'll do this."
And England too.
Well, in England. And then there's the Enlightenment, which is arguably a little bit later, but grew out of, really starting to distill some of the currents from the Reformation and the Renaissance and think about them and try and figure out like what was important philosophically in order to, you know, move away from the Middle Ages essentially. And so you get liberalism, trying to free people, trying to have free trade, free interactions, free people from their old social ties such as feudalism or the family, and constitutional government, and this push for constitutional monarchy or have some sort of written contract to control the way government operated, and then republicanism, which is no longer having a king, so rejecting monarchy, nobility, and the clergy. Very, very salutary for humanism. It's a very humanist movement, saying we're no longer going to, bow and scrape, and we're going to think for ourselves, and we're going to explore. And then the other thing was this secular epistemology. So it's no longer about finding credence for what you're trying to explain by citing various passages in the Bible. It's actually studying the natural world, actually doing experiments and saying, okay, empirically, this is the truth. So reality over myth and mystery, that's a big advance, and that's the Enlightenment. We owe it to those early naturalists, those early thinkers who broke away from this sort of very, biblical focused worldview. Any thoughts about that?
That's what
Any
1700s?
Yeah, I mean, there was certainly sparks of it earlier, but it's, 1700, Montaigne and Descartes were fairly early. And Hume. So,
He was talking and he
I
said
find
it's
it
okay.
every time.
He said it's okay.
I don't
Alright, yeah, that's-
I don't recall,
All right, that's-
recall,
all right, hang on,
I don't
hang on.
recall voting in
He said it's okay.
Hang on.
Stop.
Please,
I
I
was
do
at
not
Humanists.
recall
Alright.
it. I do not recall voting.
He said it was
in
okay.
Take it outside. Now it's worse than it would have otherwise been. Okay. Any thoughts? Any thoughts about this? This notion of secular epistemology, I think, is very important.
I just wanted to go back for a second to the previous one about the Netherlands. It was mostly, it wasn't in Amsterdam. In Amsterdam it was all about business. It was in Leiden, and then there was Erasmus of Rotterdam. Those were the Indonesian south areas. It wasn't Amsterdam. Amsterdam was all about money. The embarrassment of riches is the book. that talks about it. And of course, it ran on to Sweden as well.
And of course, Marxists would say it's an emergence of this new class of the burghers, who are traders. So it's first the merchants, and then they get into the manufacturing biz, and with the Industrial Revolution, you have the powerful people are no longer landed nobles, but they're people who control capital, right? So that's happening in the Enlightenment alongside all these intellectual developments, which is again bifurcating or fragmenting authority, fragmenting power, and changing the nature of power, political power. All right, and then political revolutions in this time period. We have the English Civil Wars, which ended up being fairly influential. There's all sorts of stuff going on, but the key thing was they killed the king off, they sidelined the lords, and they tried to write a constitution a number of times, right? So they had the instrument of government.
This actually good. Every morning.
And the humble petition and advice and all this stuff from the English Civil War was their attempt to, okay, if we're not going to do the nobility and monarchy thing, what do we do instead? And they tried, and some of the ideas were actually fairly good, but their implementation wasn't particularly good, and it didn't really last, but it was very influential. You have the emergence of radical social movements like the Diggers and the Levelers, who are sort of proto-socialist, and definitely many of them were very secular in their orientation. And although they weren't immediately influential and Britain went back to monarchy, the memory of this period was very much in the minds of John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, all these people who came later who were looking for, well, how do we reorganize the state? How do we reorganize society away from the church and away from a monarch?
Is that Magna Carta? When you say
Oh, Magna Carta is like 12, that's like 400 years earlier. So Magna Carta, that's when King John was humbled by his nobles. They insisted that he agreed to some limits on his power, and that there would be a formal voice for Parliament and government. And in fact, the English Civil Wars, there were people who were hearkening back to these Anglo-Saxon and Germanic notions of right and wrong and limits on power, because the Anglo-Saxons and those early Germanic peoples did have a notion that they weren't really wedded to the notion of monarchy. That sort of was enabled by the imposition of Christianity on those peoples, but they had this sort of folk memory of the old Anglo-Saxon ways, and that gave them this emerging consciousness of human rights that came out of this period. But again, it was pretty fuzzy. Nobody wrote them all down as like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights back in the 1600s. But they were talking about these inalienable rights, and that also was the pretext or the background that folks like Thomas Jefferson or Alexander Hamilton were hearkening back to as they were writing the Federalist Papers. And then you have the American Revolution, a republic if we can keep it. Let's try and keep it next month. The notion of the consent of the governed and checks and balances, the notion that they expected people like Franklin, people like Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison, they expected what they called ruffians like Trump to come along. They expected that there would be self-interested, corrupt people who would try and gain the levers of political power, and so they wanted to spread the de jure powers around, so that if one branch of government got out of hand, it would be checked, it would be ameliorated by the others. That one man could not ride roughshod over the entire government, and that there would be respect for minority rights and all these various things. This is coming out of our experiment 250 years ago. So again, a rejection of nobility, separation of church and state, Bill of Rights. I'm trying to remember if it's actually in the Constitution. I think there is reference in the Constitution, but they definitely have this notion that they were not going to have titles. So they weren't going to, George Washington wasn't going to grant land to his corporal, to his colonels and generals and stuff like that under him, and say, oh, well, you get this county and you get that, and you become barons and I'm the king. They weren't going to do that. And they actually said that in order to be an American citizen and participate in government, you actually had to renounce any titles that you had from Europe. That there would be no Baron of New Jersey or anything like that, which was very important. And the notion of separation of church and state, again, was gradual in the sense that the Constitution said you wouldn't have an established church at the federal level, but the states, many of them still had established churches well into the 1800s. I think the last one was disestablished in like 1830s. I forget which state it was, probably New England. But they were definitely moving in a very humanist direction. And then we get, actually, any comments on that before hit the French Revolution? So the French Revolution, you have the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. So this is going beyond our ability, it's a different concoction of writing down human rights than our Bill of Rights. And some things in common, but it's actually very different. And then they also disestablished the church, and there were attempts at creating a secular religion. And they had these, temples of liberty, and they were really trying, again, they were scratching around, they really didn't quite know how to do it, but they were trying to figure out a way to replace the structures of Catholicism in France with a secular structure, not only in the government realm, but also in the social realm. And of course they met massive opposition, and they chose to counter that opposition through a great deal of civil conflict and a great deal of loss of life. But it was simply an attempt to do it. We got crazy things, or at least retrospectively crazy things that they did, like they renamed the months of the year, right? That didn't catch on, but they also created the metric system, which was a pretty good idea. So we got a lot of things out of the French Revolution, and we were able to discard the things that were a little too edgy, a little too crazy, a little too violent, we don't have to take credit or any blame for the guillotine and the terror and all that stuff, but we can appreciate them for their abolishing feudalism and disestablishing the church and all of that. A lot of good stuff that came into that. Any thoughts from you on any of this? All right. Some early developments in America. We had the expansion of voting rights, slowly and haltingly, first to the poor, then to freed slaves, to women, to Native Americans, to 18-year-olds. Gradual expansion of the franchise. And I think that's definitely things moving in the humanist direction. Abolition of slavery. Another thing was very difficult and incomplete for a long time, but very humanist development. Public education. So before 1800, there was, as far as I know, no attempt at widespread schooling to the masses in any society, anywhere in the world. And the United States was a leader in this, and they not only made it available, they made it free. And that was like very, very radical. I mean, I don't think it was viewed as incredibly radical. There wasn't a lot of pushback. There weren't, with a lot of these social changes, it engenders a lot of reactionary behavior. I think public education went down pretty smoothly in this country, but it was definitely a very humanist thing to say, okay, not only are we going to give everybody an education, but we're going to make the larger society, in some sense, really, the government, responsible for this activity. And you may be teaching your children at home good stuff or bad stuff, but we're going to expect them to come to this building and have professionalized, gradually professionalized, they weren't that professionalized in the beginning, but gradually professionalized teachers, tell them like it is, give them instruction that is maybe counter to what the family is teaching. And that creates that cosmopolitanism. You have children, even if it's a small town, you have children from all these different households coming together and saying, oh wait, your family does it this way and my family does it, so maybe there's different ways to do things. And it really, the socialization that provided, and the common ground of culture in the taught generations was a very big boon to the team.
You told us last month about Project 2025,
right?
And one of their pillars is to get rid of the Department of Education.
Right.
Do you believe that is a sort of a Christian national motivation?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure there may be some right-wing billionaires who just want to lower the amount of outlays that the government, usually in this case local governments, they want to reduce the amount of property taxes they pay or whatever. There's definitely going to be some people who are motivated by that, but the real push behind charter schools, behind allowing states to subsidize religious schools and homeschooling and all this sort of stuff, most of that is Christian nationalism.
I think it's a little more sophisticated than just paying less taxes. They realize that the more educated the public is, the less likely they'll be able to keep their oligarchies.
That's a deeper thought. I don't know how many of them have it, but I'm sure some of them do. I'm sure some of them do. And obviously homeschooling and charter schools, there are humanist charter schools. There are people who keep their kids in homeschooling because they're very liberal-minded or because they have other rationales. It's not just, the Christian right who does homeschooling. But I would still say the majority of people who are homeschooling are of the Christian right. And the majority of those who are objecting to providing public school for others. I mean, most of the people who I'm aware of who are homeschooling for more liberal reasons, they don't object to public education for other people. They just want to do their own thing for their individual children because they want, to mold their children. But they're not saying, oh, we should abolish public education or we should destandardize it or whatever it may be.
I have a question. Do we know approximately when this happened in America? And wasn't there, the word kindergarten comes from the German,
Right. Well, so grade 1 is called grade 1 for a reason, right? So in the early days, it was first grade through 6th or maybe 8th, depending on your community. And that was public education. Later, the notion of a high school was bolted on to that concept. And that's why it's sort of considered a separate an institution in people's minds. And then the notion of extending it to younger children, I guess, and maybe I don't know whether Beata can speak to this at all, but I presume that there was a Native American attempt, U.S. attempt to broaden education down an age, 1 year in age, and they may have looked, I guess, to a German model, and that's why they came to the name kindergarten. But do you have any thought on that?
Absolutely nothing about
Okay. Yeah. But and we're still gradually doing that. I know when I first moved back down to Monmouth County, the year before my son went to school, kindergarten was only half day. He was the first class that had full day kindergarten. And then about 5 years ago, they introduced, 10 or 15 years ago, they had targeted pre-K for particular children who were identified as being in need,
Head Start.
And then they broadened that to be universal pre-K, and now they're doing a universal 3K. So they're gradually reducing it, and that's the way we're getting to, a provision of childcare for younger and younger children. So it may be that that's the only way we can do it, is by gradually lowering that public school age to the point where as soon as they're out of diapers, and maybe there's even a provision for a child care in the public school system for those who are still fairly weaned.
But there might have been public education. You say 1800 in the United States, first time ever. But I would be surprised if there was public education in the Netherlands even a little earlier, or maybe in Germany.
Yeah, I'm not really that aware of developments in Europe, but my gut says that there wasn't public education in Germany before Bismarck, before Germany was founded. So the Holy Roman Empire, all those little Dutch, I don't think they had any public education.
Well, when was Bismarck?
1880s.
1880s.
Yeah. So he's the one who founded old age pensions, all sorts of stuff. So he was an autocrat, but he had some pro-social leanings, and I wouldn't be surprised if that was the first attempt at public education in Germany.
And it's not my knowledge, but public education in Europe began with the introduction of compulsory education in the 16th century. And the establishment of the European schools in the 1950s. And the first country to introduce compulsory education was German Duchy of Pfalz in 1592, requiring both boys and girls to attend schools, and then others followed.
Okay. I would imagine it was fairly spotty in Europe, but it's interesting that there were areas that had it very early on.
And that is interesting. There tended to be, which is interesting, there tended to be in Protestant areas. Okay? Rather than in Bavaria. However, the Germans make fun of the Bavarians oftentimes as Hicks and stuff like that. Although, when it comes to how do they do in tests, because Bavaria is black, we call it black, meaning Catholic, and they do better than Berlin, which is totally liberal and progressive, and it's horrible. The education there is religious is pathetic. Which is what we school here.
All right. So I'll move on. You can come back to it, but the notion of public parkland. So people are aware of the notion of like the national parks, Yellowstone being the first national park, and then Teddy Roosevelt establishing a bunch of national parks later on. But just the notion, I mean, local communities would establish parkland, and I think part of it was just there was a lot of land available, and so many communities would reserve land for the church. They would have a church's acre in the center of town, but they also would consider public parkland, and just the notion that an ethos was growing that part of human rights, part of what people should be accorded is a place to play, a place to breathe some fresh air, and I think that is a very humanist tendency, and I think that that's something that developed, in this period, and it's spread worldwide. And there are areas, particularly in Europe, I think, where they have legislation that even private landowners have to allow random people to traverse their land as they go exploring and hiking and stuff like that. And I remember doing that. I remember we took a walk in the Cotswolds in southern England, and I thought it was going to be the American experience where you have like, the green trail and the red trail and all this sort of stuff. But no, we were just like opening farm gates and closing them behind us, and my wife was a little intimidated by these cows that were off in the distance, and she was like, whoa. And you're also worrying about where you step and everything like that. But it was a very different experience, hiking in England than here. So it'd be nice if we could move a little bit that way in this direction here. I'm not insisting that there be some right-of-way access to private lands. But again, it's a trend that is in a very humanist direction that I'm very thankful for. The emergence of secular colleges and universities. So all of the centers of higher learning, such as they were in the United States, all of those Ivy League schools that were founded before the revolution, they were all founded by religious communities. And they stayed very much under the thumb of those religious communities for most of their, for probably the first half of their history, if not more, in the case of those ones that were established in the 1600s. But there was a movement, and I am looking forward to learning more about the process by which this happened, because there was definitely something in the air, some zeitgeist to disestablish the religious component from these august universities. And I presume it was just, you get a bunch of people learning and studying, and they become a little bit more empirical, and they they learn from each other and learn from people who have come from other countries, and they go, oh, I want to actually study things, and then the religious authorities are saying, oh, well, we want to censor that, or we don't think you should explore that. And they're like, no, we want to explore that. And then they finally throw off the yoke. They go to the board of trustees or whatever, and they finally petition to get the university disestablished from the religious community that founded it. Bill?
Could Darwin have an influence on that? Because suddenly there was this massive science that everybody could read and know about, and suddenly the Bible was a little iffy?
I think so. Kevin?
I think there are 2 points about the emergence of these. One is in the United States, the land-grant colleges.
Yeah, that's land-grant colleges, right?
The federal government gives huge amounts of land, records of the land-grant.
Yes. Well, actually, it's not.
It is a land-grant.
It is now, but it didn't start as a land-grant college. Most of them did. Right.
It became a land,
Right.
it acquired the rights to land under the Land Grant Act. So it is a land grant.
Yeah.
The second is that this is a kind of industrial revolution. You're living in a highly technological society. You need, and it's very competitive, so you need innovation. You need people who are able to deal with science, and that's why you need the secular. You have this outgrowth of secular colleges and universities, and a lot of the state schools are founded because the state governments understood that to become economically competitive, you had to have a well-trained professional science, science professional class.
And there was a Seldner Morrill, Morril, maybe 2 L's, who was very instrumental at the federal level in the Land-Grant College Act, the legislation enabling that. And so where I went to school, there's a Morrill Hall named after that guy because they were appreciative of that senator.
I think the land grant legislation is called the Morrill Act.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if at least in many circles it was known after him. Go ahead, Susan.
Hi, I'm Susan from Tom's River. And I'd just like to let you know that what's going on in Tom's River, the Hasidic have been moving around quite a bit. And there used to be an ordinance that said that any property for a religious location had to be 10 acres. And the last mayor reduced that to 2 acres. So there's kind of a big uproar in so many developments now for these religious locations that don't pay taxes.
Oh, so this is a way to allow people to declare various parcels of land as being a religious institution.
But it's very new in Tom's River. Reducing that from 10 to 2 makes it quite different in Tom's River. Just sharing.
Was UVA at the university?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure, yeah. Oh, anything that's university of is likely to be a land-grant college if it's a state, except for University of Pennsylvania is one that I know is an outlier. University of Pennsylvania that name was taken by the private school that was founded in the 1700s. And so that's why there is no public institution called University of Pennsylvania. Yeah. Well, most states have 2 parallel systems: a university of and an ex-state university. Where the state university was supposed to be more applied, they were often called like agriculture and mining schools, right? So that was their start. They've now the distinctions between those institutions have broken down a great deal over time. But there still is this notion of a university of, which is usually the more prestigious academic institution, and then the state university, which is more applied and tends to focus on education and nursing and agronomy and science and some engineering and all that sort of stuff. not some, you don't go, in the old days, you wouldn't go to X state university to study Latin or the classics or philosophy. But it is changing. You can study philosophy at Montclair State University.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I wonder if Lakewood schools are suffering that badly with respect to its finances because of that same reason.
Oh yeah.
Oh, this is a big issue for
The huge,
Big
like,
issue in the life to us.
millions of dollars short
Yeah, millions of dollars short. I
in
mean, it's
Lakewood.
just awful.
Staff being reduced to
That might be one reason.
So another thing I wanted to bring up, this is something that maybe not that many people are familiar with, but the utopian communities. This is I mean, they're each their own movement, but there was definitely something in the air in the 1800s in this country where people would just form these little utopian communities. Some of them were a little cult-like, others were not. But they were all trying to find a new way of living. They were trying to experiment. And so they had experiments in democracy. They had experiments in free love, where they would just reject marriage entirely. Children were raised communally, and it was discouraged to let them know who their parents actually were. There was experiments in socialism and sort of more communistic, like kibbutz-like experiments, and experiments in religious ideas in a variety of ways. One might even say that the Mormons are a surviving example of one of these early utopian communities. And they were obviously experiments in free love there, and in religious ideas.
only for men.
Yes, yeah. Some of the free love was very, very,
Generally, it's.
but no, Joseph Smith was a pervert, that's all. It's like David Koresh of the 19th century. So, but anyway, I remember it was the best assignment I was ever given in high school. I guess it was my junior year. We had to do a term project, and the topic I was given was utopian communities. And so I got to read up on, there were hundreds of them. And some of them you'll recognize, like the Mormons, and some of them became corporations, like Amana and Oneida became corporations and changed their structure to be, a joint stock company after a while, and that's how they survived to the present day. The Shakers.
Phalanx Road.
What?
Phalanx Road.
Yes, the Fourierist phalanxes in a number of areas. One was right in Lancroft. Yeah. And some of these guys, like Fourier he was out there. He had some core beliefs that were like Dianetics or something like that, where they were like, humans were going to evolve to be very strange and stuff like that in his philosophy. He also, I think he was the one who also wanted to establish towns at specific meridians. Like he would every degree of latitude and longitude, at exactly that point there should be a town, and they should be spaced out evenly. And he was a bit of a nut, but there were all sorts of people like this. What?
Or visionary.
Or visionary. But again, what this did is it broadened people's horizons. It gave people new notions of what was possible. And often these communities, they would form in an existing, reasonably well-populated area, and then they'd be driven out because people would be objecting to what they were doing. And so they would say, all right, we got to get out of here, and we'll move to Iowa, we'll move to wherever, and some of them, like the Mormons, moved many times. They started in upstate New York, and they moved to Ohio, I think, and then Illinois.
Didn't they start in Tom's River?
No.
Thank you.
But I wouldn't be surprised if something comes out of one of our New Jersey communities.
But
one of
what's
these days.
that was in Tom's River?
And-
Also, there a rejection of the industrialization that was going on, particularly in the Northeast.
Some of them were very agrarian.
Go back to the land.
Yes, yeah. But, almost like the Khmer Rouge, but, in our country. Yeah, year zero, and we'll reject all these modern conveniences. Fortunately, none of these people had enough political power to round up other people and put them in camps and take away their glasses and stuff like that. But, it was interesting times. And so some more recent developments. So, and this is like within living memory, right? Abolition of Indian schools. So the stolen generation and saying we're not going to do that anymore. We're not going to take children away from their parents and raise them and abuse them. Abolition of the eugenic practices that started in the late 1800s and went all the way up into the 1970s. So racial segregation is part of racial segregation, was clearly to try and keep the white race pure and all this stuff, right? Immigration restrictions, a lot of the immigration restrictions that were coming in the early 1900s, and then really in the 1920s, immigration was pretty much ended. And that was very much based on notions of good genes and bad genes, good society and bad society, and trying to keep people out who they thought were undesirable. And then there was a lot of sterilization that went on. Almost every state in the country had some program to sterilize, particularly women who had fallen into becoming a ward of the state. They were in a prison, or they were in some sort of a group home or something like that. They would often, routinely sterilize them. Or if a woman who was indigent came in with any sort of medical problem that required anesthesia, and they were not paying for it themselves, and it was charity care, automatically they would tack on a hysterectomy. Because they were like, we don't want these poor, unfortunate people having more children. And so that was only, those programs were really only done away with in the early 1970s. There was some congressional investigation in the early 70s, and they passed legislation to do away with that. Any thoughts?
That is mental defects, what they call it. In fact, there was a very shameful Supreme Court decision upholding those measures, sterilizing those who did not, measure up cognitively. It was a very shameful time, not just for people that we think of today as right-wingers. There are a lot of people that we think of as progressives and liberals who also espoused a lot of these.
Eugenics had its moment.
Yeah.
It was very eye-opening and very enlightening to some people. People really thought that this was the way forward, and it wasn't just right away. Margaret Sanger, who was founder of the Planned Parenthood and very involved in birth control, she had a lot of good motivations, but there was also a subtext of eugenics in there. Some of the even well-known African American leaders like W.B. Du Bois was very pro-eugenics, and he had this theory. Yeah, he had this theory that the poorer blacks should be sterilized or shouldn't have children because they were bringing down the black race, and he advocated that all the races should identify their top 10% and isolate themselves and form a more perfect humanity.
You now call that the Ivy League.
What?
You now call that the Ivy League.
The Chinese actually, there's this famous 7-foot whatever, I forget his name.
Yao Ming?
And where they put the parents together, because they were very tall,
Right.
to produce this super tall person, and
Yeah.
he became the star in Texas for basketball team. I love that guy.
Yao Ming, I think. I think it's Yao Ming. Yao Ming. Yeah.
But the Americans also were the foundation for the Nazis got their idea about all that eugenics
there was definitely a lot of cross-pollination between eugenics in Germany and in the US.
So this sterilization also target mostly black people?
And Latinos. I was in my research for this. I discovered that in Puerto Rico, in the middle of the last century, 1 in 3 women were sterilized. Yeah, so that's a really big. Many of these programs in the mainland United States were fairly small scale, but in Puerto Rico they really brought it to really wide scale.
Do we know if it focused on the Ireland or across the world?
I didn't look into it too deeply, but to get to 1/3, that's not just people who are coming in for some other operation or who are a ward of the state. It could be uncompensated care, like people who can't pay. That could reach 1/3 of the population pretty easily. But so I don't know the mechanics of it, but apparently it was very, very prevalent. And it happened in other countries. There was a big story just recently about a restitution made to women in Greenland. The Danish government was not sterilizing, implanting IUDs in Greenlandic women as recently as the 1990s. Without their knowledge, without their consent, they would come in for some other procedure and they would insert an IUD before they left. And they would wonder why they couldn't get pregnant. And some of them, they would have complications and we wouldn't know. They didn't know that they had it, so they couldn't tell their physician, oh, well, maybe you should think I have an IUD and that could be the cause of my issues. They were like never sexually active. And so it was unknown what the problem was. Apparently, and this is 1990s. And you think of Denmark as being a very progressive place. No such luck.
I learned some time ago that in Canada, immigration specified 2 classes for people. A, Western Europe, B, Southern Europe, C, Eastern.
Yeah.
Okay? So you had points of depending where you're coming from. And it's very hard to find data because nobody wants to talk about this now. But as far as I know, in the 70s, it was still working just like that. Okay? So there were like 2 classes of immigration.
In this country, the big watershed movement on immigration was 1965. LBJ passed an act that changed the way immigration was going to work and made it much easier for family to focus on family reunification and skills. And they actually thought at the time that the family reunification provision would mean that most of the new immigrants would be people who were related to people who were already here. But what happened was, it was the new immigrants who came in through the skills portion who then brought their families. And that was an unexpected development to the drafters of that bill. Okay, so then the civil rights movement, I think was a big humanist development. Women's rights movement, co-education, and the gay rights movement, and the notion that the state would look inside the family and deal with domestic violence and other issues inside the family and police that in a way that they never had before. So it's not just the Me Too movement, but it's also the notion, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, the civil authorities were very reluctant to get involved in any sort of marital disputes or disputes within the family. So people were allowed to abuse their children, husbands were allowed to abuse their wives with impunity. But it's only in the last, 50 years or so that laws have been passed and enforced to allow the state to come in ameliorate those
I wouldn't
issues.
say 50 years, I would say closer to 40, not 50. I know from personal
Okay.
experience, it's not 50.
Yeah. Well, that's why it's one of the more recent ones on the left, one of the last ones
No,
on the list.
basically, I mean, unless you have broken bones, the top of that you do everyone.
And I think that's pretty much all I wanted to cover. I think that's, oh, wait, no, I have so much stuff. I have so much stuff. So, what time have we got?
You're good. 20 of them.
Okay, so I'll try and go through these a little quick. Go ahead.
The one thing I don't know if you're going to talk about this, is as we enter the Cold War era, the reemergence of religious iconography and talk and language in American secular society that hadn't either been there before quite as openly, and what role that played in where we are today, for example, with very, very powerful religious communities that are poised to take over the country and to impose their order.
Yeah, well, I think that religion always had a pretty significant role in American politics, but it was a little bit under the radar, and it wasn't quite as obvious. I think there was an effort made to not bring religion into political campaigns in the past. And I think it may have been driven mostly by religious people's sense that their influence was slipping away. The elimination of prayer in public school and all these various things really made these people go, wait a minute, our basic assumptions are being questioned. We need to get more politically active. We need to organize. We need to fight back.
Well, I'm thinking of God we trust.
Yeah.
Thinking about under God.
In the Pledge of
These
Allegiance,
are all-
in the
these are all
50s.
Cold War,
Right.
Cold War era manifestations of Americans' religiosity that wasn't there before.
Right.
And the role that those sorts of symbols eventually began to play. And I think sort of breaking down some of the role between church and state in this country.
Yeah. Susan?
So recently, I'm a member of the American Legion in Toms River, and their common comment of everything is God and country,
Right.
and that kind of thing. And I said, for God and country, that's what they do, for God and country. Everybody signs their reports and everything. So I made a suggestion that it would be more inclusive if they said for flag and country. So this was initiated by an email that was sent out to all the members, and it was from National, that they were proposing different bylaw changes. So I said, great time for me to make a suggestion. So I got a letter, an email back just to me saying, you have overstepped your bounds, and you need to move back up north, and you need to do this, and you need to do that. So
Save that email.
did they think I didn't know how to copy that and send that to everybody else? Which of course I did. And then that person disappeared. But I mean, in this day and age, where veterans have said to me, they say that if you're in the pits or whatever, everybody believes in God. And I said, that's not true. And the veterans, there's veterans who are, non-believers and everything. So,
You are good trouble.
yes,
Yeah.
So it's very interesting. I mean, that was, and then, listen to, wait, just a little bit more. Now, my ex-husband, of course, he's an ex because he's an idiot, but he was a commander there at one point. So we've been separated, partially divorced for 6 or 7 years already. He calls me up and says, wow, my phone's been ringing off the hook. What? He said, what did you say to the American Legion? And don't bring my name into and don't do this, don't do that. I'm like, are you kidding me? This is not your town. This is not your state anymore. You're in Florida in the villages. Really? I mean, honestly.
Or traveling fast, or
And you know,
but it's a dissident in the midst of it.
I was like, so now I haven't been back to this. I don't go there often anyway, because it's not, they have Fox News on all the time, whatever. But my brother's a veteran, my father was a veteran.
Yeah.
And I believe in helping other people. But anyway, so that's a funny story.
There is an, or I don't know how active it is now, there's this sort of fledgling organization sort of affiliated with, you know, the whole humanist movement called Foxhole Atheists.
What is it?
The Foxhole Atheists.
Oh, I love it. Oh, really?
Because the idiom that you were looking for is there are no atheists in a foxhole.
That's it,
Right.
foxhole.
Right.
And so it's called foxhole.
Foxhole Atheists.
Oh.
Yes. Yeah.
What has always puzzled me is there is Austria and there's Germany, and they still don't have separation of church and religion and government. And yet, the most fanatic and volume-wise, most extensive religious influence is here,
Yes.
rather than in a country over there. They don't have all this. They don't. Even though the church and and you have to pay church taxes. If you're born, you have to pay church taxes. Nobody asks you. And I always think, why do they put up with it? And they say, well, the church does all the charity and all that, so we don't pay them. I think that's just.
Well, it's always been that way.
And
Yeah.
they don't want to make a
Well,
big issue of it. However, over here, we've got all this religious influence
Yeah.
on the government where we have
Yeah.
separation of church.
Yes.
Yeah. You're familiar with the organization called Americans United for Separation of
Yes.
Church and State.
Yes.
So, I think in every publication, they have this quote from James Madison. And I don't remember the quote exactly, but he basically makes the point that separation of church and state protects religion as much as it does government, because otherwise the political forces corrupt the church and people no longer have faith in the church. And that's what's happened in Europe in many societies, is that the church was too overbearing in a political way and people rejected that. And I assume that if I mean, I hope this doesn't happen, but if in this country the Christian right begins to really take hold, there'll be a significant backlash, and then religiosity will decrease in
I'm
this
not so
country.
sure if there's going to be such a significant backlash. That's certain at all. The more I read what's happening within that community, under the radar, that's really scary.
Catholic hospitals are refusing to emergency treat women who are in labor. Even in California this was happening. So I guess that doesn't happen in Europe, right?
I fault the doctors in America. I fault them tremendously for not speaking up for the rights of women.
Yeah. And it's been pretty quiet.
Yeah, they're quiet.
Yeah, it's all about them money.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, in this, I mean, I'm making a gross generalization here, but in many countries in the world, people go into medicine because they are interested in biology, they're interested in medicine, they're interested in helping people, they're interested in caring for the sick. In this country, most people who go into medicine are going for the prestige and the money, and caring for other people is just a means to the end. It's oh, I got to do that in order to have doctor next to my name. Oh, I got to do that in order to make a lot of money and be influential in my community. All right, I'll do that.
Yeah, I would say that's true for the specialists, not the GPs. Not the
Yeah.
GPs.
Yeah.
Just don't have specialists.
Maybe not the pediatricians.
Yeah. But
It's an embarrassment to talk that you have to do the human connection. It's almost an embarrassment from the experience
Well, doctors have been instructed for years for their own psychological health to not be involved in their patients, just in case something goes wrong or whatever. Also, they've had the incentive and they've been told by their insurance company also, you gotta see 10 patients an hour. You should not be doing any chit chat in the exam room. It's gotta be bang, 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 and that's it. Never?
And I think the medicine's going to change even more because hedge funds now are buying medical practices on the left scale.
They're already having
We just went through it.
Yeah, and it may take legislation to undo that.
any trust.
Yeah,
So I just listened to, I listened to Dr. Radio from NYU Lango in New York, and they were talking about in the South that many colleges and universities are not taking any GYN. You know, people are not going to those classes.
yeah, it's not that they're not taking, it's people who refuse to go there.
And they're moving, and the doctors that live, the GYN doctors that live in those states are leaving.
Yes.
And so they're without a lot of care in those areas.
Yeah.
Texas.
Yeah, it's just awful. I mean,
The tragedy is that most of those areas, there's a lot of poverty.
Yeah.
You know, so
Yes.
if you don't have the resources and support for
Yeah.
women,
Well,
and then you add that to
Yeah.
physicians leaving.
for the last 50 years, government policy has tried to incentivize new doctors to go to underserved areas, right? One good example, there was even a TV show that was set in Alaska with a physician who had gone to Alaska because he got his loans forgiven or whatever, and that's all that progress, what little progress is made, is all going to be reversed by the fact that all these underserved areas are anti-abortion. Yeah. And in fact, that was probably part of the reason why they were underserved to begin with. So I was just going to talk a little bit about some of the economic things. So antitrust, breaking up the monopolies and reducing the power of the elites, labor unionization, regulation of food and drugs, workplace safety, consumer protections, all sorts. I'd like to see much more of that. That's been latent for a long time. I'd like to see much more consumer protection. The New Deal and Social Security to provide a backstop for people, to not let people go hungry, to not let people be driven down into poverty. Yes, yeah. That was 2 generations before it came here. Yeah. Another anti-poverty program, socialized medicine such as it is, Medicare, Medicaid, Children's Health Insurance Program, and Obamacare. Affirmative action and diversity, equity, inclusion programs, and environmental protection. I threw that in here. It's not totally economic, but there's some economic component to it. But to try and give people a healthy water, we're going to eliminate lead pipes. I mean, we're still doing that. Hopefully, we'll finish that this decade. And then I was going to talk a little bit about our hopes for the future. And China. Yeah. So if people don't like the wrong guy, so I'd like to see more regulation of harmful religious practices. First and foremost, refusal to vaccinate your children. That we gotta crack down on that. Not let them scare the crap out of their children with all this hellfire and brimstone stuff.
I recently read that they're refusing to give polio vaccines.
Oh yeah, anything. Yeah.
Polio regime.
Yeah. Well, I guess you can give credit to their rationality. Once you reject one vaccine, they're extending that to reject all vaccines. It's a logical consistency among these crazies.
But it's just not just religious people.
Yeah.
When if you're in California,
Yeah.
you come across a lot of secular people who are anti-vaccine.
Yeah. So just the elimination of this deference to religion and group rights in favor of much more respect for individual choice and individual rights. I'd like to see more regulation of the harmful effects of technology. That's everything from pollution to, kids being addicted to TikTok or all these things. I mean, you have to be careful with how you regulate, but I'd like to see some attempts really made to mitigate some of the things that we've seen. Solutions to disinformation. See some of that, right? And I'm just going to run through these because we're running sort of towards the end. Expansion of opportunity and freedom for the disadvantaged, restrictions on the freedom to exploit others in the workplace and otherwise, and just social provision of the necessities of life. So that's right to health care and easy access to food and other basic necessities, shelter and other basic necessities of life. I think that's very possible, but most societies, including ours, have chosen not to do it.
There's one, I think it's a country, I forget who, but there's a country who's trying to pass a law that officials are not allowed to lie.
Where is this?
No, it's happening. I don't know how far the legislation is going, and I don't know which country it is, I forgot.
It's Russian.
Right. I mean, I looked at them and I said, look about somewhere, it's somewhere out there, and it's not disinformation. They were trying, I don't think it was a state, I think it's a country that's trying to make it illegal for officials to lie.
And I think a lot can be done for the disinformation. I think a lot can be done by just passing laws and forcing them to take the profit motive out of the disinformation. So you give people their free speech. They can say whatever they want. But the minute they're making money on something that's demonstrably false, that's when you find them. And that's when you bring them up on charges.
The problem isn't just the making money, it's that they're not held to account. They don't go out and do that.
This lawmaker is trying to make it illegal for politicians to lie.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wales.
Okay. Okay.
Why don't you move there?
Go ahead.
They love it.
Talking about hope, one of them is that organizations like the AHA or Center for Inquiry, I think that the only time you hear about them, in a large basis is when they're against something. They're against the Ten Commandments in Louisiana. Thank you. And even the AHA, good without God. So they're removing something. Can they start pushing things that are positive, as opposed to the only time you hear about them is when they're against something? I came up with the phrase, please, I'm sure it's lousy, and that is like secular humanism, morality for humanity. Something like that. But push it out there like we have a good answer here, as opposed to, look, you're doing something wrong.
Right. And part of that is being visible as part of other causes, like being visible in the George Floyd protests, or being visible in women's rights issues. All these things that I've listed and others that I consider to be pro-humanist or humanist developments, we should be not only appreciating but moving forward and being visible in those movements and in those causes.
One thing
but there's always a trade-off between being visible, but then also trying to just not be divisive within those other movements, because you want to focus on the goal of that movement, not wearing your T-shirt all the time.
One thing I would add to this list is to require all schools, including religious schools and charter schools, to educate kids on biology, chemistry, math, and physics, and also check to make sure that they're doing that I looked up the New Jersey Constitution. It says it has two provisions on education. One of them is that good public education shall be free in all communities, in all towns. And the second one is free transportation will be provided to all schools, including non-public school, which I think it's an outrageous conceit to, and it's an undermining public education because we're spending millions of dollars on, we could have been spending that for public education. But also, there's nothing that says in there that you need to teach science to kids, like climate science or,
There is state curriculum law.
But
that
is
says
there a law?
students- Yeah,
Okay,
it says,
there's a
I don't
law.
know if it's law, but there's definitely state guidelines, state mandates that say every student has to take at least 3 years of mathematics and 3 years of language arts and 2 years of history, and I don't remember exactly the precision of it, but I remember when my kids were trying to decide there's high school schedules, it's like, oh, we got, I may not be very interested in this subject, but you got to take something. And if you're not going to take physics, then you have to take some sort of other physical science something to be the physical science, right? Maybe
But I wonder if
geology or
that's
something.
the school or the town, and does that apply to other schools that are not public schools?
I doubt that there's probably some sort of carve out that if you're some private or religious school, that there may still be some regulations on you, but it's probably much more loose.
I had that experience, if you don't mind, because I was working volunteer in Lakewood. So the whole thing is those schools are mostly religious. They get public transportation, free public transportation from the state. Why? Because they have a part of state curriculum, okay? But when you have a contract with the students, they are religious schools, okay? So you may take a look at Lakewood, what it looks like. If you get some information about what is on the taxation part of the town, you can see the picture of totally religious community with big schools supported by the state. Okay, so they found a way how to mix one with the other. But those people, those students are being raised in totally religious way. Okay?
Yeah, I mean, there are religious schools and then there are religious schools. Like, I mean, if a student going to like CBA, for instance, they have a religious education class, but they do learn physics and chemistry and history, and it's not, the religion doesn't like pervade the entire curriculum. It pervades the experience of being a student there, but like, they're not teaching chemistry in a religious way.
It's not the case of Lakewood.
Yeah, yeshiva is going to be a whole different issue.
Those students ask me, why do you wear it? There is no problem. Okay. If we wanted to play some music, they said, no, my school is not allowed. You have to ask the school what kind of music you play. So you're talking, they have state curriculum at the same time, but their mentality is absolutely completely different from the people coming from public schools. Okay? I had a quite experience with stuff that anybody wants to take a look at that thing, it's definitely something as well.
So how did you get involved in music choices in the school?
No, I mean the public, if we had we're in a public space, those kids, play something, the kids we are not allowed to listen to music, we have to ask in school. And you can take a look at the numbers, they get public transportation, and the town of Lakewood is really doing poorly. You can even take a look, you can see it, because they claim that transportation has been, the schools are state curriculum, okay? But they are very good, okay, in making all that whole schooling in their advantage, okay? That was my shock, frankly speaking, that I could see something like this in the 21st century. It is over there, large scale, really funny. There are few articles about this, okay? Not so many, but yes, we're talking about this, but nothing is going on. It's actually even going deeper and deeper.
Eric, could you kind of summarize any of this work, this probably like yes or whatever? Could you a little bit summarize what you just heard?
Oh, he was just saying that the state of New Jersey puts some requirements on schools that receive funding for the transportation, for busing from the state. But he's saying that many of these schools are able to comply as little as they must and still have a very, very religious character in the way that they're meeting these requirements. And they're not really providing the sort of maybe sex education or more cosmopolitan, historical education than the state curriculum would expect.
I heard from a person who came out as gay, he was Orthodox, and he went to the yeshivas in Lakewood, and he said the parts of the book would be either torn out or they'd be glued together for them, so they had no access to like sex education or evolution or that.
And really, it's completely against separation, our constitution. Separation of church and state. I don't understand how these states are allowing this.
What is the money?
So long ago.
Yeah, I think the money.
But the money gets, religious institutions have so much of their own money. They
What
need
about the Mormon church?
Some of them do, some of them don't.
I mean, the Mormon church is like a bank.
Yes, well,
It really
so is the
is.
Catholic Church.
No, I think one of the church's issues here is that because they're Jewish, and if you start down the road, I've had legitimate concerns. Unfortunately, the conversation is shut down very quickly because you're labeled as an anti-Semite. Right? But there is actually quite a bit of research and literature in this area from within the community, even, or more secular Jews look at that is perhaps the only angle that is seen as more legitimate, because it's tricky. It really is. That's why I brought up the Mormon Church, for example, the Catholic Church as well. I mean, we have systems in place that allow for religious institutions to accumulate so much wealth and influence and power. And part of that is the no taxing.
Yes.